Hey friends, have you been blessed or encouraged or challenged by Theology in the Raw? If so, would you consider joining Theology in the Raw's Patreon community? For as little as $5 a month, you can gain access to a diverse group of Jesus followers who are committed to thinking deeply, loving widely, and having curious conversations with thoughtful people. We have several membership tiers where you can receive premium content. For instance, silver level supporters get to ask and vote on the questions for our monthly Patreon only podcast. They also get to see like written drafts of various projects and books I'm working on, and there's other perks for that tier. Gold level supporters get all of this and access to monthly Zoom chats where we basically blow the doors open on any topic they want to discuss. All of my patrons play a vital role in nurturing the mission of Theology in the Raw. And for me, just personally, interacting with my Patreon supporters has become one of the hidden blessings in this podcast ministry. So you can check out all of the info at patreon.com/Theology in the Raw. That's patreon.com/Theology in the Raw. Hello, friends. Welcome back to another episode of Theology in the Raw. My guest today is Andrew Bunt. Andrew is Emerging Generations Director at Living Out Ministries in the UK. And so Living Out Ministries is kind of, it's almost like not formally, but it's almost like a sister organization to the Center for Faith, Sexuality and Gender, which I'm a part of here in the US. Andrew has become a friend over the years. We got to hang out a couple months ago in Cambridge, England, and just really just love the way Andrew thinks. He's got a great story and is such a sharp thinker. He has studied theology at Durham University and King's College in London. He's the author of several books, including his most recent book, Finding Your Best Identity, subtitle, A Short Christian Introduction to Identity, Sexuality, and Gender, which just came out. So please welcome back to the show, the one and only Andrew Bunt. Andrew and I actually hung out in his, well, sort of your stomping grounds. I mean, you had to drive 3 hours north of your city, but it was in the UK. So yeah, we hung out over a nice meal in Cambridge, and first time we saw each other in person. But you were on the podcast, I think, a couple of years ago. So welcome back to Theology in the Raw.
Thank you. Nice to be here again.
Give us a snapshot of who you are and what led you to want to write this book.
So I'm Andrew. I am a Christian who loves Jesus, who's also same-sex attracted, who's also had questions around my gender. So I wrestled with all of those kind of things. That very much shapes what I do now with life. I kind of have various roles in Christian ministry, but most of them around equipping people to think through what does the Bible say on questions of identity, sexuality, and gender. So I work for a UK charity called Living Out, and we exist to help people, churches, and society talk about faith and sexuality. Just started a newish role there, moved into a different role, focusing on emerging generations. So I'm particularly thinking, how do we help under 25s and those serving them, working with them, think through questions of sexuality, gender, and identity in relation to Christian faith? And I guess, the book grew out of my own experience of wrestling with my sexuality and gender, a series of identity crises I have had throughout my life, which made me really think, actually, there's something to be explored here about not just the question, who am I, but the question, how do I find who I am? How do we actually form identity, which is kind of at the core of the book.
So this book really is, I mean, it's really very much integrated with your own story. And well, so I just, so my audience knows, I read the book, I endorsed it. So so if I ask questions like I don't know anything about the book, it's more so my audience can get to know you and your book. But so the book itself kind of grew out of your own personal experience, and it does. I mean, I'll just say it has a really beautiful personal flair to it, and yet it's incredibly thoughtful too. It's not a memoir, but it has a lot of memoir in it. It's not just an introduction, because it has memoir pieces, woven throughout. Can you unpack? I mean, most people understand when you say you're same-sex attracted. In this day and age, people are, I get, I understand that, whether somebody else might have that experience or know somebody who does. But when you said you're wrestling with your gender as well, what did that look like? Did you see those as interconnected or kind of two separate parts of your narrative?
Yeah, well, I mean, the way it's kind of manifested for me, there was a time in my childhood I remember very vividly reaching the conclusion that I was a girl trapped in a boy's body.
Okay.
I remember it so vividly because I remember that at the time, the way it kind of hit me was suddenly this fear that I would get pregnant. Obviously, I didn't know how these things work, but my kind of thought process was, oh no, I'm a girl trapped in a boy's body. What if I get pregnant and people find that out?
Oh wow.
And so I remember concluding that I have to not get married, have to live with my parents all of my life, and just kind of hide this big kind of secret. And that feeling did naturally go away as I kind of went through my teenage years, and that's not an unusual experience, and actually it's particularly not unusual for that to happen, for that to naturally go away. But then an individual in that situation to find that they are same-sex attracted. So lots of studies show there's a kind of a high occurrence of that experience then flowing into a later teenage years and into adulthood experience of same-sex attraction. I think what happened then, I think as a child, I was so conscious of being kind of gender non-conforming, of not fitting the normal patterns of what boys are deemed to be like. My church context probably had fairly narrow views of what men and women are like. And I think I just was so conscious, even though I might not articulate it this way, that I didn't fit into the kind of box I had understood, if not being presented as what a boy is like, that I thought, well, clearly that's not me, therefore I must be a girl. And that's what happened. That feeling, as I say, kind of naturally went away as I went through my teenage years, particularly. But what I was still left with wasn't a sense of being a girl trapped in a boy's body, but a sense of kind of not making the cut as being a man. And I look back now and realize I used to say things, I'd be talking to a female friend and I say things like, well, he would say that because he's a man, which is kind of the men are over there. And I don't think I'm a woman, but I'm not kind of in that group. And I kind of even in saying things like that without realizing it was kind of distancing myself from being kind of a real man or kind of making the cut. And so that means that even more recent years, it's an identity question. I've had to wrestle. What does it mean for me to be a man? How do I live that out? And how do I wrestle with this fact? Yeah, that in lots of ways I don't conform to the kind of stereotypical expectations, at least, of what men are like.
Would you say you were or would have been diagnosed with gender dysphoria, or was it more just you used the phrase, gender non-conforming behavior? Because those are two different. There's some overlap, I'm sure, but like those are kind of different categories. So
no, they are, and I'm careful not to talk about having had gender dysphoria, because I would not have met the kind of clinical parameters for clinical diagnosis. So that DSM-5 gives kind of, I think it's like 8 criteria. You have to meet 6 out of 8, so it's pretty high terms. I kind of can't help wondering, given where we are, so in the UK, where we've been for the last few years in terms of gender questioning and gender dysphoria among young people, how seemingly quickly, easily people have been given diagnosis of gender dysphoria. I kind of wonder if it had been now and I had gone to a gender clinic and described what I was feeling, if they may have diagnosed gender dysphoria, even though I think looking at the DSM criteria, I wouldn't quite make it. But no, I think you're right. I think there are, and these things often occur on a spectrum. And I think I want to be careful not to say my experience was the same as someone who experiences much more, considerable kind of extreme and much more consistent and persistent gender dysphoria. I think mine was for a period in my childhood. It wasn't a long-standing thing, but it's a very vivid memory kind of in my mind. It certainly sticks out to me as a childhood memory.
Would you say, now, how old are you now again, Andrew?
31.
Would you say now you've resolved your I don't know what phrase to use, manhood or whatever? Like, do you feel like you're like have a much more theologically expansive view of sex and gender to where you don't struggle anymore with your identity, or do you still feel like there's such cultural pressure that it is a constant kind of battle in your mind? Or
I think I've grown a lot more comfortable. I mean, the wonderful journey I went on, what God really helped me to see, which is part of what's in the book, is the realization that being a man is a given identity given to me by God, that actually being a man doesn't mean having to act in a certain way. It's not something I make a reality by acting a certain way. And so I talk about knowing who I am as a man, because God says I'm a man, through my body, allows me to be how I am. And so it has grown my confidence in lots of ways. I'm much more relaxed now about being gender non-conforming. I often talk and joke about I'm very comfortable with admitting my love for Downton Abbey and musical theatre, and the fact I'm quite flamboyant. I'm unashamed in saying I don't like rugby, beer, aggression, all those kind of things. But it is interesting, and so on many levels I'm really comfortable. But it was really interesting just this week noticing it's the World Cup, obviously, and in the UK at least, even people who aren't big into football, kind of get into the World Cup. I confess I
Mhm.
don't, but I was at someone's house while the football was being watched with a group of guys and girls. But there is something that happens to guys when they watch football. So my mates who aren't normally particularly kind of stereotypically masculine become kind of much more stereotypically masculine. And I found myself feeling really uncomfortable.
Oh,
And it
wow.
just was an interesting thing to me. God's done wonderful things, but for all of us, these things are always an active choice to keep living in the good of the truth of who we are and what God has done and stuff.
Mhm.
Kind of was in that environment. I had to remind myself, no, it's okay. I'm a man because God says I'm a man. It's okay that I'm not like that. I don't have to try and fit in that. And also, I don't have to feel kind of intimidated by that. That's not a threat to my masculinity
Right.
when other men are being more stereotypically masculine.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, even I wouldn't say, because I think so many people have. If you take gender nonconforming interests, behavior, personalities as a
Mm.
spectrum, I would say probably most humans would be on that spectrum somewhere.
Yeah.
I would say the majority of my likes, dislikes, whatever, are not gender nonconforming, but there are a few that are. For instance, and I think I've talked about this on the podcast. Like I have always hated to see death of any kind, an animal die. Even now,
Mm.
I will reload. Well, sometimes I kill a bug. Sometimes I do, but my preference would be to relocate the bug, put it
Mm.
outside. I don't like to see anything die, especially
Mm.
a bird or an animal or whatever. And even though I do, well, I have hunted and I do enjoy hunting as long as I eat the food, because I feel like, well, if I'm going to eat meat, I better be willing to kill it.
Yeah.
But I mean, I do that maybe like once every 5 years or something, so it's not like a big part of my life. But like, so there ha there ha even for someone like me who doesn't really experience a lot of gender nonconforming, the parts that are there's especially growing up super insecure, like, oh my, this fear of
Mm.
like being found out, or the pressure of like acting the part so I come off as being a real man, like, oh yeah, beat up this, kill that animal, whatever. And there's other parts of my life that would be more gender nonconforming, but it's I can only imagine somebody who maybe a big part of their life has atypical gender kind of interests,
Mm.
whatever. That's got to be incredibly hard, especially in the church. I mean, have you experienced like the church to be as a culture better, worse, or the same as the broader culture? Or
Yeah, I don't know. I do think more so when I was younger. So I grew up in church context. I think there were much clearer in complementarian kind of context, and there was much clearer or many stronger stereotypes about what men and women are like. I think less so now, and part of it, I think, is just I've grown comfortable in who God says I am. Therefore, I'm able just
okay,
to kind of live that out and not be too bothered what people are thinking. I sometimes talk about one of the most meaningful things anyone ever said to me was a fellow leader in the local church here who has two teenage sons, and he thanked me for showing his sons a different way of being a
oh
man,
wow, yeah,
in the sense of actually showing them you don't have to live out all these stereotypes to be a man and to be a faithful follower of Jesus as a man. Now, I know on that one, he said that to me the morning after I'd been at an 18th birthday party with those two, his two sons the night before, which kind of made me think, what did I do at that party? They went home and said to their dad such that he said that the next day. But
yeah.
still, I think there is something powerful in us leading by example that way. And I do think, so in my own context, we have got better at realizing just the good God-given diversity among people in our kind of
Mhm.
personality preference and stuff.
This is why
But
the
I do agree with
church.
you that it's incredibly widespread. And as I've kind of shared that story of not gender dysphoria, but as an adult, a lower level discomfort with my identity as a man, so often when I share that, people really
Mm,
resonate with it. And I think it's a much broader experience and struggle that people have than we might
yeah.
think
Oh
or be aware.
yeah. Oh yeah. I see it all the time. Whenever I give a talk and I talk about kind of gender stereotypes and how the Bible affirms a sex binary, and yet gives us a lot of freedom of what that, when we say like live out your womanness, live out your maleness, like
Mm,
just that idea is very, very broad and flexible in the Bible. It's concerned about
yeah.
holiness, not being stereotypically masculine or feminine.
Mm,
Whenever I go there, I get loads of straight people, especially I would say a lot of women. I get so many amens and thank you for saying. So there's so many like, you know, whatever straight. Um, I don't like the phrase cisgender, but like straight non-trans women who never really had gender
mm,
dysphoria, but they're still like Yeah, I've always felt this pressure of being super feminine, and I never really fit in that box, So this is where what I was going to say is I just feel like the church really needs leaders like you to be able to give people that sense of relief. Like, oh my gosh, here's somebody who is a leader. They're up
Yeah.
there. I can look to as a model of like, and I don't have to fit this box that I feel like I'm always being crammed into. Um, let's talk about your book. Can you give us an overview of what it's all about? I love that it's short, concise, thoughtful. It's something you can give to somebody who might not even be a reader that, if you give them a 300-page book, they're probably not going to read it. Walk us through the book and yeah.
Yeah. So at the heart of the book really is saying we need to ask a question about identity we often forget to ask or overlook. We understandably ask the question, who am I? Good, important question to ask. We don't ask very often the prior question of how do I find who I am?
Okay.
And I think a lot of our problems around identity come from that. And it's maybe worth saying I define identity in the book, and the kind of concept I'm working with is identity as our controlling self-understanding. So how we view ourselves, what we see is most core to ourselves, most fundamental about ourselves. And that's controlling in the sense of what you deep down really believe about yourself will inevitably have impacts on how you think, how you feel, how you act. So it's controlling in the sense of it inevitably overflows into an impact on your life and your experience of life. And so I say we need to look at that question. And really that's flown from my own experience, that both in wrestling with sexuality and gender and wrestling what the Bible says, wrestling what culture is saying to me about that thing of where do I find identity has been really key. But also some other things I wrestled with, just of the kind of disconnect that we can experience between knowing what God says about us but not experiencing that. I also found that the kind of bridge for me for solving some of that was the question, how do I find who I am?
Okay.
And so what I do in the book is to look at two ways that our culture, or certainly modern kind of Western secular culture, very often answers the question, how do I find who I am? One of which is that other people decide who we are. So our sense of self is kind of absorbed from what people think of us or what we assume they think of us, because often we don't kind of know, with the idea they kind of evaluate us against some sort of criteria, make a judgment, and we absorb that. So one of the stories I share in the book is that in my mid-20s, I had a fairly major kind of mental health crisis. And one of the things I realized was going on was I actually had a really poor and destructive sense of self. I'd come to believe I was a freak and a weirdo, that no one really liked me or loved me, God didn't really like me or love me. And that was because I genuinely assumed that's what people thought of me. They thought it, well, it turns out they don't, but I kind of absorbed that from them. So others decide is one really common answer. But another common answer is I decide. It's kind of the opposite. We reject what other people think of us. We kind of don't care what they think. We look inside of ourselves. We look at our feelings and our desires, and we embrace those as who we really are. And therefore, the narrative goes, we need to kind of express those regardless of what people think or what our body says or a community or a tradition or religion. We need to express that and live that out in order to find our best life. Both of those, I think, have fairly major problems. But the Bible offers us a better, more life-giving answer to the question, how do I find who I am? Which is that God decides. It's not based on what other people think of us and their evaluation. It's not based on we finding side. It's what he says over us. And I think when you look in scripture with that kind of perspective, you find almost like two levels of identity. There's a human identity given to us by virtue of God creating us and what he says over us in creation, our being in the image of God being the kind of central thing there, giving us inherent worth and dignity. But then actually that we, if we respond to Christ, receive the best possible identity, a transformation of identity, where what God thinks of us and says of us isn't based on what we do, thank goodness, because we all muck up all the time, but it's based on what Christ has done. And so it's the one truly solid and stable identity, because God's not going to change his mind about what Christ has done. He's not going to change his mind of what he thinks of you if you're in Christ. And it's always a wonderfully positive, life-giving identity, because it's what God the Father thinks of God the Son. It is that thing of being brought in to experience the relationship of love that for all eternity past has existed between God the Father and God the Son. And then I kind of take that as a foundational way of thinking about identity to see, well, how does that map onto sexuality and gender? Both how do the kind of culture's approaches map on our culture, but how does the biblical approach to identity give us a better foundation from which to handle our experience of sexuality and gender, whatever they kind of may be.
Okay. So you've done a lot of thinking on just the concept of identity. So let's just dive into the deep end and talk about identity terms in the sexuality and gender conversation. Let's begin with what might even be the easier one now is you describe yourself as being same-sex attracted. You know the debates about whether a theologically traditionally minded Christian should ever use the term gay or the phrase gay Christian. What are your thoughts about these different identity terms? Are these primary issues? Are they secondary, or does it depend on the context? Or I mean, there's many layers I can give here, but yeah, what are your thoughts
I
on?
mean, to be honest, my thought is the debate around actual identity labels, actual kind of language and stuff has just become so unhelpful and so distracting from the important thing. So I interchange between describing myself as same-sex attracted or gay, partly as a way of choosing to not take part in the debate in a sense, and partly just I think the debate is kind of unhelpful. There are some wise points on both sides. I can see both positive and negatives for both of those terms, for example. But I think the debate around language, what often becomes kind of policing of people's language, of you should and shouldn't talk about yourself like that, which sometimes leaves people like me thinking, how on earth am I meant to articulate the reality of my experience? I need some language. Give me some language. Let me have some language in a sense. But actually, my big worry really is those things which I think are just words and can just be descriptions of experiences, not statements of core self. I think actually that debate gets in the way of us thinking, hang on a minute, there are some real people here who Jesus loves and we should love, who might well be having some real things they're wrestling with, real difficulties. Our priority wants to be loving the people, not getting caught up in the language they're using. So on the actual thing of language, I just kind of think the debate has become so unhelpful because it's become, for some people, the presenting issue and kind of the stopping point of the conversation, not actually just the language we need to have in order to have a proper conversation about real people. And so for me, I'm not so concerned what language we do or don't use. I'm concerned about, I think it's important we think about how we conceptualize ourselves, because that does have an impact on our life, that controlling self-understanding I talk about. I think it does influence how we're able to live out biblical teaching well. But I don't want to get hung up on language as the kind of be all and end all in that reality.
So it depends on what you mean. What's the meaning behind the language, not the language itself, right? Like I could say
exactly, yeah.
I could say I'm an American. Somebody else can say I'm an American, and the value invested in that same phrase could be wildly different. I'm just making an objective statement of fact about my nationality, where somebody else could mean that as my all-controlling primary identity is that I'm an American. Everything else is subservient to that. That's how, and I've, again, just anecdotally, I've seen that with the word gay or gay Christian or whatever. Do you find that is this as much of a debate in the churches in the UK, or do you find that it's primarily an American kind of thing?
Yeah, it's a bit of a debate over here. Sometimes just because people are aware it's a debate over in the States.
Okay, they're reading books by.
You get kind of on the extreme ends on both sides. You would get a minority of people who feel very strongly either way, who either think, no, I absolutely mustn't refer to myself as gay. That's conceding too much ground to my experience, making it my core sense of self. The other end, you get people who very much object to the language of same-sex attraction, because they feel it's too much trying to distance ourselves from the reality of being gay, as they would put it, or because it's kind of tied up with a history in the ex-gay movement and stuff. That would be kind of, though you would get those kind of perspectives, but they are quite kind of, in a sense, the extreme ends of a spectrum where most people, I think, are somewhat more relaxed. And my observation is that when I get asked about it, whether in personal conversation or kind of a Q&A context about a church or an event or something, very often actually the question isn't being asked because the person feels really strongly on one end. It's just they know some people feel really strongly, so they're interested. And so interestingly, I think in a sense it's an intellectual debate people know exists, so they're interested in the UK more than actually something they really have a strong view on their one side or the other, which I do consider is a blessing we have over here. It doesn't tend to get so fraught and so difficult.
I really prefer British evangelicalism to American. Even I felt so at home when I was living there. Just like, I don't know, it was just, it's hard to describe. It was just, people are able to have good, healthy, disagreeable discussions and then go to the pub after and hang out. And like, there is this, they love to kind of wrestle with the intellectual side of things without taking it personally. And you just don't have the politicalization of the evangelical church. Like
that's the big
in
thing.
America. Oh, it's huge. Yeah, huge. I remember coming back after living in Scotland for 3.5 years, like coming back and like like I was like back in the wild, wild west again. I'm like, oh my gosh, I forgot how stressful this is, like, and maybe it's, maybe it's, there's a lot fewer churches and Christians, right? In the UK. So you have this really strong kind of more secular environment, so that, and that often
Yeah.
fosters, more camaraderie across denominational lines. Like in Aberdeen, when I was in Aberdeen, there was, a small handful of solid Bible believing churches. Some were Presbyterian, some were Baptist, some were non-denominational, but it's almost like you didn't even care or know. Like if you're a gospel centered believer, like, oh man, we're brothers and sisters in Christ. So I miss that. Yeah, I miss that environment. Let's okay, so let's talk about the different gender identities. Where do I even start? So I mean, you have transgender as kind of, can be kind of almost like an umbrella label in some ways, but then you have, especially among you work with younger people, so I mean, gender, uh, gender fluid, non-binary, and many others. Do you find those labels to be neutral, helpful, or not helpful? I don't know if I'm framing that the best way, but just to kind of get our conversation going.
Yeah. I think it's such a difficult one. I mean, with the caveat of, again, not wanting to police people's language, I think it's
Yeah.
unhelpful. But I think the question you're asking is good, actually. Are these terms, helpful, both for communication and for individuals and their self-conceptualization? I think it varies. I think so. Even I think my own experience, I think, well, I know that experience of feeling internally like one's sense of being a man or woman doesn't match with the external body. I know that can be very real. And so therefore I want to say, well, yeah, absolutely, there should be language to
Okay.
describe that and kind of conceptualize of that. But again, I think it'd be unhelpful for us to build our core sense of self on that. And my theological position would be that to allow our internal sense to trump the objective reality of the biology God is giving us is not the right way to conceive of things. So it partly depends, how is someone using those terms would be one of the things and the kind of cautions I'd have in mind or questions in mind. With young people, I think it is very significant. We're in the situation over here where for years now, young people have been told through kind of influencers and social media and such like, but also through school, that they might be one of this real plethora of gender identity labels and they need to work that out. And the expectation was is there'll be a label to describe their not quite unique experience, but their personal individual experience. And I think that has been unhelpful. I think it's a helpful pressure for young people. There's this pressure to label yourself, and there's just this weird contrast, isn't there? On the one hand, there's a lot of people saying it's not about labels, it's about being yourself.
Yeah.
And yet the kind of pressure to find your label and to come out to announce that is kind of huge. So I think I'm worried for young people about the pressure it puts on them, especially around the gender question, as we're seeing over here. But also I'm worried about the impact it has on a young person's self-conception, but also the ongoing experience. So as you'll probably be aware, over here at the moment, there are healthy questions being asked about the way we offer particularly kind of medical treatment and clinical support to under 18s who are questioning their gender. And one of the things that's come out from the review of the NHS, that's our National Health Service's kind of treatment of and services for under 18s, is that even kind of changing names and pronouns and stuff is now being seen as a significant psychosocial intervention, which does make it less likely that a young person will find their discomfort with their gender naturally abates of its own accord. I wonder if the same is therefore true of these labels. If someone labels themselves as, for example, non-binary and kind of consistently refers to themselves as that, has other people recognize that and announce that, I wonder if in the same way that we now know that changing name or pronouns could have an ongoing impact on the continuation of that experience, if the same could be true of those labels. And so when it comes to sexuality or gender, I kind of encourage young people particularly just to feel no pressure to find a label and kind of self-describe or self-identify, and no need to kind of tie things down to, well, this is the label that describes me. Because it is true, in a sense, labels don't matter. Your experience might change over time, but if us find it does, you don't need to pocket yourself into a little corner of here's the label. So I kind of want to balance it of, we need language to describe experiences. And that's really important. And we don't want to suggest experiences aren't genuine, which sometimes they really are. And we want to validate the pain, the difficulty, the struggle of that, but also not have language which is unhelpfully
Mm-hmm.
forming people's sense of self, or potentially doing them harm in the long term. Very
That's
difficult nuance to get, I
yeah.
think.
That's the incredibly insightful 2 minute summary of a complex topic. And I totally, if I don't want to just repeat everything you said, because I agree pretty much everything. I think everything you said, like just not leading with the idea of not policing language, not making that kind of the end all. And yet, yeah, I see it. I mean, I think the anxiety that can come about of trying to this cultural pressure to find out who you are, and the list of
Mm,
possibilities keeps expanding, rather than just being a male or a female with, who might be attracted to men or women or both or neither. Beyond that, you're a human and you have a range of interests and likes and dislikes. And so sometimes
mm,
I don't want to. Let me affirm one more thing. So I have friends that, finding that, for instance, a friend that, had, moderate to sometimes severe gender dysphoria when she, the word in same sex attracted, but the word lesbian didn't fit because it had too much femininity kind of infused in it. And so when
mm,
she discovered the word transgender, it was just the way she describes like the life-giving power of knowing that I'm not some freak of nature, that there's actually a word that
mm.
describes my experience. And for her to describe how liberating that was, like it's so good for someone like me to hear that, and to see some, okay,
Yeah.
I can totally see that, because most people that don't wrestle with their sexuality or gender, they just mock and dismiss and roll their eyes at all the identity labels. And let's be honest. I mean, when there's like, hundreds of different, after a while, you kind of, how do you not, kind of roll your eyes? But like,
Mm,
um, yeah, but also, I don't know, like being genuinely curious about how some of these labels can be genuinely life-giving and maybe it's a temporary thing too. Maybe it's just as they're trying to figure themselves out, a label can be helpful for maybe a season in life. Having said that, I've just seen, especially with younger people, yeah, just that anxiety surrounding discovering who they are, and a quest for uniqueness and meaning in life. And like you said, it is every study I've read says that, identities and pronouns and other things are a form of like social
mm.
transitioning, which every study I've seen, somebody who socially transitions, that's a very strong push towards other more medical interventions. And that's when I'm like, oh my gosh, that's something that just a sexuality conversation doesn't have to deal with. Okay, you're gay, you
Yeah.
call yourself gay,
Yeah.
you're same sex attracted, whatever. But there's no like next step medicalization that you're playing with here, which can be super, well, not good for teenagers to engage in. But
Yeah.
is it too? I mean, some of the identity labels, they seem almost like just describing personalities. And again, I'm not saying this across the board for everybody, but like something like gender fluid. I know people can use it in different ways. It's like, some days I feel more masculine, some days more feminine. You kind of have somebody unpack that, and it's
Mhm.
kind of like that's just kind of like,
Yeah.
do you
And
need
this
a
is where,
label to describe just what is? Some days I'm kind of like to wear black and go emo. Other times I might resonate with a stereotype that matches my biological sex, and like, cool, great, you're human. Like that's probably a lot of people. Probably a lot of people feel gender fluid. I
yeah,
mean,
yeah, yeah.
as I try to wrap my mind around what people mean by that term, am I missing
No, I think you're
something?
absolutely right. And I think, again, this is one of the differences between the sexuality conversation, the gender conversation. One of the reasons that people who haven't had experience around gender find it hard to understand is sexuality is a part of human experience that has quite concrete impacts on us, even biological impacts on us that we can kind of
Yeah.
see and recognize. And almost every adult human can kind of relate to those. Gender, we can't so much. And it is,
Hmm.
to be sexually attracted to someone, most of us can conceive what that means. To be, for example, a male bodied person who feels like a woman, it's very hard to articulate what that means. Of course, then we get into some of the more philosophical problems of, well, often the definition is a woman is someone who feels like a woman. Well, that's a circular definition. What does it mean to feel like a woman? And
Yeah.
so often, once we do kind of uproot things or take the body out of the equation, once we do go to what I call an I decide identity, rooted in what we feel inside as to whether we're a man or woman, there's pretty much nothing other than stereotypes of what men and women are like on which to build that definition. What does it mean to feel like a man or woman? There's not much other than stereotypes to kind of attach that onto. And stereotypes are primarily about personality and about preferences. So I think you're right. Very often when you hear people describe what does it mean for them to feel non-binary, say, or gender fluid, say, it is actually about personality and preferences, which when I think it through, I think isn't all that surprising. Now, I also want to bring in the kind of pastoral side of I remember how vividly I did feel like I was a girl trapped in a boy's body.
Mm.
I really, even though I look back now and realize that was me being shaped and influenced, I think, by
Mm.
stereotypes. That experience was very real. So what I don't want to say is, oh, this is so absurd that people are questioning their gender when all it is they have a different personality. I don't want to be
Mhm.
insensitive or kind of naive like that. But I do want to say, I think a better way of helping people isn't to say, yes, your personality and preferences do reveal who you are as a man or woman, and neither in a way which we just can't articulate what that even means, therefore, to be a
Right.
man and woman. And I think does raise some fairly
Mhm.
serious issues about particularly protection of women's rights and stuff. Rather
Right.
than affirming that, I think actually it's to affirm, no, actually, it's okay that you are a male body person who likes really different things to other male body people, or who has really different kind of personality, that sense of freedom of I can just be myself. And actually, isn't
Yeah.
it amazing that God's created such a diverse humanity, and in our real diversity, even on the level of personality preferences? Doesn't that make him look even better? Doesn't that show something of the beauty and the creativity of God? And then when actually these diverse personality and preference people kind of unite as the people of God and worship, isn't that amazing? That's actually a
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
beautiful thing to be claimed here about how different we all are and the way God has made us, which is actually flowing from a solid identity, but things that are different about us that kind of describe us don't define us. And I
Mhm.
think actually is much more freeing and life-giving for us to approach it that way. And I do think brings glory to God as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah. So when you say if you can go back in time and like when you truly felt like you were a woman trapped in a boy's body, like why did you think that? And can you describe why you thought that without falling into stereotypes? Um,
I don't think I
it,
can without throwing into stereotypes. No, I think I was just so aware of not, fitting into or not being like other boys. I never connected to boys. I had pretty much no close friends who were boys as a kid. You know, at school, I was the one lone boy trying and failing to do handstands with the girls while all the boys were playing football. All
yeah.
my close friends were girls. I never felt comfortable with guys or felt comfortable with girls. Lots of these things just kind of made me, look around and think, well, all these things kind of tick the boxes for what girls are like, not for
Yeah.
what boys are like. So I don't think there's anything outside of stereotypes that I could personally have
Right.
um, identified as different.
And I don't even because this is my with things like gender identity or internal sense of self as male, female, both or neither,
Mm,
gender expression, how you express yourself, gender role. Do you fit into the masculine or feminine expectations of being a man? So even these
mm,
real textbook definitions of gender and gender identity, expression, role, it's like they all seem to be connected to gender stereotypes just intrinsically. Like you can't even explain any of them, really unpack them on a definitional level without latching onto or depending upon stereotypes to give your explanation meaning. And I don't say that here's the
mm,
thing, like sometimes when people roll their eyes and gender stereotype, I'm not denying the social psychological power of stereotypes. I mean, I
yeah,
think it can
yeah.
create, if not influence or cultivate gender dysphoria. Not that it's all that, but I mean, I think that can play a role. So
Mm.
to say there's a social factor here with stereotypes is not to diminish the profound experience at all. It's just to kind of maybe to unravel some of the philosophical underpinnings of some of these identities. Maybe I don't know.
Yeah, and I think, I agree. I don't want to undermine or invalidate the experience at all. And I don't even want to say that gender dysphoria is always a lot of stereotypes. I
No,
don't I
no,
don't think that chimes with lots of
yeah,
people's experience. And I know just because that was my experience, but I said I wouldn't have classified as gender dysphoric for diagnosis. I don't think that's the universal thing. And although I don't think there's yet evidence of it, I'm very open to the fact there could be biological factors,
Sure.
physiological factors, which lead someone to have that experience, it still leaves open the question of how do you best respond to that experience, and also the question of how do we define what a man and woman is. They are related but separate questions. And so even if we found, say, a physiological, biological influence which was clearly influencing someone's experience of gender incongruence, that wouldn't suddenly solve all the questions about how do you live in light of that. What does it mean to be a man or a woman?
Yeah.
And so it's always, and that's why I think we've done badly often in these Christian conversations around this, of we aren't good at separating out the reality of experience, which in a world marred by sin for all of us will be messy in every area of life. We should expect messiness, complexity, things not to be straightforward. We need to separate out that from kind of actually what reality is and God's good word and good plan and good guidance, and then also from what does Christian faithfulness look like for those of us who do want to follow Jesus. It's when we won't do the hard work of kind of parsing those out that I think we get bad answers, and often particularly insensitive answers and approaches.
Yeah. So yeah, you work with, I mean, younger people. So in the work that you do you find this kind of quest? Do you find it pretty popular to kind of figure out who you are and people exploring different labels? Is that fairly common in the work that you do? And if so, or even if it's not common, just in the people that are on that quest to kind of who am I, do you find that that's not helping them and just finding meaning and flourishing in life? Is it typically a hindrance?
I think so. I mean, yeah, as I talk to youth leaders, I never talk to a youth leader in the UK who doesn't have one or more young people in their youth group who are in some way questioning their gender. You wouldn't find a teenager in the UK who doesn't know multiple peers, friends at school or college, whatever, who are questioning their gender, identifying as trans or whatever. And I don't know if there's the firm evidence, but I do strongly suspect that where, so over here, we're seeing a huge mental health crisis among young people. There will be multiple factors in that, absolutely no doubt. I am pretty much convinced one of those will be this kind of pressure to work out who you are, pressure to reach that conclusion, pressure to announce that, live that out. And it links to identity stuff. We're told we need to find our best identity, and we're told, young people are told that's who they are inside, because it's by embracing that and living out that you live your best life. And so the young people are living with this sense of, if I don't actually work out who I am, I'm going to miss out on my best life. And you kind of get the influencers online who realize they're trans, start taking testosterone, had a mastectomy, life is suddenly wonderful. They're living their best life, and it's the wonderful, glossy Instagram, TikTok, YouTube world, which looks so appealing and makes us all think that is the pinnacle of best life and fulfillment in life. And young people, it just reaffirms this message of, I've got to work out who I am so I can live it out, because look how happy they are. That's the way you find true happiness. It is ultimately a salvation narrative. And so we need to church, and there's a better salvation narrative in response to that. And one of the reasons it's so good is there's no pressure to work out who you are. Actually, you get to receive who you are as a gift. You can know who you are. You can know that you're loved. You can know you're accepted, know you're delighted over, not basing anything you do or what you find inside, based as a gift, based on what God has done in sending Christ. That's wonderfully good news for us to offer to people under this pressure to try and find the best identity and the best life.
And maybe it'd be helpful. I mean, identity, especially as there's so many different identity labels now. Especially when teenagers are trying to figure out which identity they fit into, do you find that they know that in almost every case, these identity labels, except for maybe gay, straight, maybe bisexual, almost every other one is temporary, right? That's just an observation. Like, how many 15-year-old girls who identify as non-binary will have that same exact label till they're 48? Just factually, it's just a very small percent. I mean, Lisa Diamond did, a 10-year longitudinal study on 100 non-straight women, and I think don't quote me on this, but you might be able to quote me on this. I have it written down somewhere. I think it was something like 3% of those 100 non-straight women identified the same way, because every 2 years she would check in and kind of do a review, and even their sexual, let alone their sexual exploration was kind of all over the map, to where at the end people were like, I don't know who, I was a lesbian 10 years ago, and then I said I was bisexual, and then I fell in love with a man who, wasn't a jerk, and then now I've got 2 kids, and I don't know what's going on. I'm just a human, and there's been many studies, but this is where I feel like, if the identity label is real thin. It's not like a strong ontological, this is the kind of human I am and will always be. If it's understood that this is just a way I'm trying to name my experience right now as I'm going through just the chaos of teenagehood, but I don't see it. It does seem to be like, no, there's all these different subcategories of being human. You need to figure out which one you are. And that
Yeah.
because back in high school,
I think if it was just describing experience, that's potentially helpful, because it is helpful sometimes to describe experience.
yeah,
Right, and that's what I'm trying to say in the book, is these things can be real realities. They can be descriptions of our human experience, and we want to recognize and acknowledge them and wrestle with how to best respond to those, but they don't have to define who we are. And the unhelpful thing is when we say, this is core to who I am, this is my controlling self-understanding, and therefore I must kind of fully embrace this and live this out to define my best life. I think what's also interesting, there's this kind of confusing inconsistency of two things. One, there's the narrative of you must look inside yourself, find who you are, live out, find your best life, which kind of implies you'll find one static thing. But at the same time, of course, we're seeing a proliferation of fluid identities and young people being quite open to that. And you're right, often often there's even, as you know, kind of a specific progression of, often it's kind of bisexual to non-binary to trans identifying. And I think that's interesting. There is an openness to young people about labels changing, but I think it's usually in one direction, not in the other. Barely ever do you hear a young person very open to the idea of, last year you were here and you identified as non-binary, but actually now you're saying you're pretty comfortable being a girl, which is how you've lived all your life, and biologically you're female. It kind of doesn't work that direction, it works the other direction, which partly I think is the social pressure that we've got over here of, in our youth culture, in our culture at the moment, to be queer and to be trans is to be cool, and to be straight and cis is the most boring thing and the worst thing possible, because you're boring and you might well be homophobic or transphobic. I think that's the kind of assumption there. Actually, to be gay or same-sex attracted doesn't make you particularly popular or cool in the UK youth culture context. My understanding is what really marks you out is being trans or non-binary in some way. And so I think there's a real openness to change of labels if it's in that direction. If it's in the other direction, that doesn't seem to be, which is why we see the sad reality of detransitioners who, again, legitimate experiences, it seems, who are often just trying to talk about their own experience, and even talk about their own experience, let alone any comments on how that might impact the experience of others or suggestions of wisdom for how others handle their experiences. Even sharing their own stories gets them kind of shut down. If people aren't open to hearing that, traitors, all those kind of accusations made against them. So there's an openness to fluidity, but only if you're going in the right direction, not if you're going in the wrong direction.
So are you at a place now, not in the church, but in the broader culture, where being gay or same-sex attracted or lesbian or whatever, like these are just more kind of like how straight was 10 years ago? It's kind of like, that's not a big deal anymore. Like,
I think so. I think especially among, yes, I think that's true in wider culture. I mean, these things are not monolithic, obviously, but I think in some contexts I've heard that being gay or same-sex attracted as a teenager at school is not a easy experience. But being trans, you do become popular if you're the trans kid, the non-binary kid. And and there are some, you get some stories. There's so many things are feeding into trans identification among teenagers, I'm sure. But you get some stories where there's a kid who's kind of pretty unpopular, kind of on the edge and stuff, doesn't have many friends and stuff. They come out of trans, suddenly they're one of the most popular kids in school, and they're the hot, the cool gang and stuff. And that could raise the question for us, is for some young people, only some, is trans identification actually a way of rescuing themselves from the unpleasant situation they're finding themselves of, maybe feeling rather left out, rather overlooked, not being one of the cool kids. And actually it's a way to find some favour with people. And one of many, many possible situations, and there are various situations of what are going on, but it maps onto the experience and some of the stories you hear.
Well, and there's been several studies on it, and I know they're politically incorrect to talk about, and you certainly don't want to say like this is true of all people or whatever. And this is where I think older LGBT people who, it was the opposite, right? Like they were mocked and abused and sometimes beat up, and so they had to really hyper different experience. It's hard for them, I think, sometimes to wrap their mind around being trans being like elevating social status rather than being, demonized. But yeah, I mean, it's things have become so politicized. I'm always careful, like, is this really true? Is this just like in America, is this a right wing talking narrative, or is this actually the case? But I just over and over and over again, it is interesting that when I'm in more progressive cities, Portland, Seattle, New York, Chicago, whatever, like, how you actually talk to kids and describe what's the social environment of school like, and it's exactly that. Can you can you give us a firsthand, I guess, I mean, you're in the UK, because I keep hearing that things have really shifted in the UK, where the UK, I always like to think, is like, 5 to 10 years ahead of the US. They're always more progressive than the US is. It's funny. I was when I was in Cambridge, I was at a pub talking to a couple of guys, and one guy described himself as, I'm a left winger. I'm like, oh, so you probably like, we got Bernie Sanders, he's like, oh no, he's way too right wing for me. I was like, there's not a person in America who would ever use the word right wing to describe Bernie Sanders, but it just shows how, I think he even says, yeah, I'm a Marxist socialist, and Bernie is just, might as well be Donald Trump, from his perspective. So here's where I'm going with this. It's interesting that as in this conversation, the UK was kind of more progressive than the US, leading the way, but then now they're pulling back with some of the gender stuff because they're seeing that they, I don't know, for lack of better terms, went too far. Kind of like, oh my gosh, like now we have all these detransitioners, and you have the case of Kira Bell. They went all the way to the high court where she detransitioned and felt like she was rushed through early transition as a confused teenage girl, is in her own words. Are you seeing that firsthand, that like there is some, even from secular, liberal, whatever, some rethinking their policies?
Definitely. And I think there's almost like there's been this, as I guess these things happen, this ground level beginnings and movements, things like, Kira Bell's personal experience and other people like that have similar experiences, and then the court case, but then also kind of whistleblowers at Tavistock, which is the under 18s gender identity clinic here in the UK, who were raising concerns about safeguarding young people in these contexts, raising concerns about whether young people were too quickly being given access to puberty blockers, say, or mastectomies and different things. That has happened. Parents began to talk out. There's quite a good kind of ground level parent movement here of parents who are concerned about what their young people are being told at school, what's happening at gender clinics, different kind of things. It's kind of gradually worked its way up. So now we are at the stage where there's a government commissioned independent review into the under 18s NHS gender identity services, and called the Cass review. So Lady Hilary Cass, who's a very experienced paediatrician, is leading this independent review into it, which then released an interim report, I forget exactly when, a number of months ago now, which basically was raising huge concerns about how the NHS services have been acting. The kind of specification of the whatever it's called, overview they're doing isn't to decide on kind of the philosophical questions of, is there such a thing as a trans kid, but actually of how do we help these young people who are experiencing gender dysphoria, questioning their gender, on the basis of the interim report. And I think this is interesting. Even on the basis of the interim report, even before they've got the full report, they're going to close the Tavistock clinic at the start of next year. And they've just recently released the interim specification, which is kind of the proposals for the replacement. And basically it is a significant shift from what was predominantly an affirming approach, as in you assume that what the young person is saying about themselves and how they feel themselves to be is who they are. So you do use names and pronouns as they request. You do fairly quickly move to various forms of social and medical intervention. The flip now basically is the default now is a non-affirmative approach. So only extreme cases of demonstrable clinical distress will names and pronouns, for example, be used in line with what the young person wants, rather than with their given name, pronouns along with their biological sex and stuff. And so it's a complete swing, because the Cass review showed there really is evidence that even social transition is quite a significant psychosocial intervention, is the term. It has big impacts. We know there's the evidence that many young people will find that if those interventions don't take place, their feelings of discomfort will naturally resolve. We know that these social interventions make it less likely that it will happen. Therefore, that seems to be not the best way of treating young people. And also, the Cass review has highlighted what was already known, which is the way the cohort of young people being referred to gender identity services are not reflecting the general population. Much higher levels of mental health diagnoses, of ASD, autistic traits, of traumatic experiences, a much higher number of children who are in care, who are looked after children, has been noticed. And people are now rightly asking the questions, why is it that actually this cohort of young people isn't representative of the rest of the population?
Wow.
And realizing those things tend to get overlooked because gender just takes over. We need to help young people think about traumatic experiences and how they work through those. Think about whether they might have autism and how they begin to understand themselves, if that is the case. Think about how they handle mental health. So we're moving towards a much more holistic kind of approach to this. And the other thing that's happened is one particular very prominent kind of trans teen charity that supports young people towards an affirmative approach has been through a load of scandals about various trustees and people they were linked to.
Oh, wow.
And advice to be given to young people. The Charity Commission is now doing an independent review into them, so they're kind of crumbling too. So it's kind of worked from the ground up that suddenly now on a policy level, positive things are happening towards the safeguarding of young people.
That's pretty remarkable in a society that, again, is fairly progressive, speaking as from an American perspective, where Bernie Sanders is seen as a right winger, that there would be such, I don't want to say drastic, but I think maybe just some pullback on the trend, because we still don't have that in the US yet. And I keep telling people that we kind of follow along the European countries typically. And so I keep saying 2 to 5 years, and I think there's going to be some rethinking. The only difference, though, is that our healthcare system, somebody explained to me, and I'm not an expert in this at all, but it's because I used to say, well, give it a few years, there's going to be so many lawsuits now, like Kira Bell's case.
Yeah.
I mean, there's just money talks. And so when you get enough doctors being sued, they're going to start to rethink, are we really treating these kids well? But the healthcare system here is so protected legally that as long as there's some kind of consent form signed, there's not going to be a lot of pressure from lawsuits or whatever.
Yeah.
But even ideological, but then I don't know, like WPATH just released the World Professional, what is it? Of Transgender
Association
Care,
for Transgender Health,
They released the recent kind of like Standard of Cares Act or whatever, the Standard of Cares, and it's the same, if not even more, I think. Gender affirming than it always was, and I still, when I talk to doctors here, there's still this like, oh yeah, you don't question the gender affirming approach at all, because you'll be accused of killing trans kids, because if you're not fully gender affirming, then you're, increasing suicidality. So I don't see it yet changing in the States, but
no, I think there are good groups in the States, people like Jen Spector and stuff, who are trying to get, evidence-based medicine and evidence-based responses to this kind of work and that. But I have less insight, I guess, than you in the States, but I think that's the case. I think in terms of the, isn't it surprising that we who, are kind of in to use these terms, a very progressive liberal society and stuff, we are the ones who are, I think, pioneering in some ways actually a change on this. I think, though, it is because what's being shown is harm, and the one thing in our secular liberal society that matters is harm. So the reason I've always said the tide will turn on the trans situation, trans teens especially, in a way it won't sexuality, is because there is demonstrable evidence of harm. And so what's happening basically is we are looking at how we've treated teenagers in the last 10 years when they've reported gender dysphoria and we referred to our National Health Service, and realised that actually the way we've been treating them has not been based on solid evidence, may well have done harm. And so actually that's, it's the harm argument is always powerful. And particularly in secular cultures like ours, harm becomes pretty much the only basis, the only common basis for ethics. So whether that will work out in the States, I don't know, but I'm not overly surprised it's happening here. It has happened quicker than I thought it would. But because I think there is, and there will increasingly be, both evidence of harm and also evidence that we just don't know if some of this stuff is safe, that does fit the kind of thing
Right.
that would cause us to change.
And just to be clear for people listening that may be like, oh, this is all kind of new to me, like, you have different standards of care for, let's just focus on teens, who are wrestling with their gender identity. The gender affirming approach is kind of like if someone says they're trans, then they are trans. And you don't really explore kind of the holistic psychological well-being of the person.
Mhm.
Because you don't at all. It's like there's such an allergic reaction against like even hinting that their gender dysphoria could be linked to some kind of psychological condition they're wrestling with. And yet, I mean, you said it, and there's been studies done that, like, I think over or just about 50% of trans identified teens are wrestling with at least one, if not several other mental health issues
Yeah.
that, again, according to one study, a small percentage of caretakers chose to even explore, that this person had past trauma. They went through 2
Mhm.
divorces. They were sexually abused as a kid. They have been diagnosed as bipolar. But if they say they're trans, sometimes everything else just takes a back seat. Let's just focus
Yeah.
on affirming your trans identity, not exploring maybe the maybe more complicated psychological web that could be surrounding this identity. So it's not even like a liberal versus conservative thing. It's just there's several different historically there's been several different approaches to treating or working with somebody with gender dysphoria, and I think the UK and other or even like the Nordic countries or Sweden,
Yeah.
where there's more of a watchful waiting. Let's just not intervene. Let's just see the biological process just play out. Or who was it? I'm blanking on his name. He was an expert in gender dysphoria who the biopsychosocial approach where you explore the biology, explore the psychology, explore
Mm.
the social side and so you explore the holistic person,
Yeah.
and just rather than just rushing them through medicalization. So it's
But I do think
complicated.
just going to say, I think it is complex. Yeah, the ascendancy that we had seen, though it's now going back down, of the affirmative approaches described, is rooted in what I'm talking about in this book about I decide identity. It's rooted in
Right.
the idea that who we really are is found inside, that we really do have this thing called a gender identity. And that really does dictate who we are as a man or a woman. And which, of course, the interesting thing there is that's not actually a biological or medical fact. There's no way you can prove the reality of a gender identity. There's no scan you can do, test you can do to isolate someone's gender identity. And so what's very interesting, I think, is the affirmative approach to trans medicine is kind of based on this philosophical idea of this internal gender identity, and that our internal self reveals who we really are,
Mm-hmm.
rather than being based, as now I think this kind of pushback over here is, on actually let's do some hard studies and look at the research and work out what actually does and doesn't prove life-giving to people, what is actually going on.
Yeah.
And so I would actually submit that I think one of these cultural narrative identity that I talk about in the book has kind of infiltrated our understanding of an experience and even infiltrated medical responses
Mm-hmm.
to it. And the positive step that's been taken now is actually maybe this isn't about identity, but maybe it is a very real experience. And so let's explore what that experience is
Mm-hmm.
and how we best help people in that circumstance, rather than just jumping to it's who they are, we've got to affirm it. So I think although it's, the medical world, it's actually very rooted in philosophy and thinking.
Yeah. Even if it's not explicitly said that it just is, right? I mean,
Mm.
or it's also like, and I'm not sure, I think you guys have the same thing there as we do here, just this conflation of, SOGI, sexual orientation, gender identity.
Yeah, yeah.
And we know that sexual orientation is often has biological factors, at least is often unchangeable. Sometimes there's fluidity, sexual fluidity within an orientation, but typically people don't
Mm.
swing from genuinely like attracted to the same sex, opposite sex, we know. So sexual orientation has this kind of more maybe I'll say innate. Whereas, and if you just assume gender identity is kind of like the stepchild of that or whatever, but it's not. Gender identity
Yeah.
it's so different than sexual orientation, just on a philosophical level. Which is why, I mean, I honestly think, and I would say this if I wasn't a Christian, this isn't like a theological observation, but the whole soji, I think, is just disastrous, really. I mean,
Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah,
like the conflation of the two.
I do agree. Yeah. And then I think you're right. I think as a non-Christian with no theist outlook, you can say that. But then I always want to put, but as Christians, actually, we get to bring in also
Yeah.
the Christian or Judeo-Christian perspective of, and because there's real people here, we're all having very different experiences, and we care about the real people. So let's actually treat people as people, find about their own experience, rather than having this lumped together thing of actually very diverse experiences, which doesn't actually help us to love and care for individuals well. And actually, I think the kind of more people-centered approach, actually something we as Christians should be championing for,
Right.
because we are people-centered people, because we have a people-centered God who cares about our well-being, us, and our own experiences. And so I always want to encourage Christians, these aren't just kind of, medical, clinical debates. Actually, they're also places where we want to bring in the heart of God and the care for a person, not just an issue or topic.
Can you speak to, now you got a few more minutes left, talk to a parent right now who has a 13 to 17-year-old kid who just came out as trans or non-binary, gender fluid. How should the parent love their child well? How should they respond?
Mm-hmm. The first thing I'd want to say to Brit in that context is don't panic. I think often that is just our response. Just don't panic. Don't feel the world's about to fall apart. Don't feel you've got to rush to do anything much. One key thing would be just to talk to the young person and just find out more from them. Again, it's validating them as an individual. Don't assume you know what they mean when they say that. And just spend lots of time listening before you say anything, actually. You're saying you now identify as non-binary. Help me understand what you mean by that. Or you say, actually, you feel that you're actually a boy. Just help me understand, what do you mean by that, actually? How long have you felt this? And what's it been like for you to feel that? Because what you're doing is you're more deeply understanding their experience, which is going to be helpful for loving them well and responding well. But you're also just loving them in that. And what you're showing them is, even if actually you might not agree with some of how they're viewing themselves or some of the decisions they want to make about how they're now going to live, you do care about them as an individual. It's a completely different message that sends to a young person than immediately going, well, oh no, you're not trans, don't be silly, no, you're not changing your name, no, it's not happening, we don't do that in this household. That's just crushing a young person. But actually, that sounds like it's been really hard for you. Please tell me some of what that's been like. Tell me some of just, what do you mean? Help me understand what you mean when you say you feel this way. That might then have actually some openings. When someone says, well, I feel like a girl because this and this, that might be a place to, well, but actually, can't boys be like that? It might be a place to just throw some seeds of doubt, because it might well come down to, as we've kind of said, stereotypes and stuff. Pray would be an obvious one, but I think just let's not overlook that. Let's get some wisdom from God on that. Be prepared for the fact it will be a long journey. I don't think these things resolve quickly, but actually, especially with teenagers, no, actually, it's that they're on that journey to independence anyway. So it's much more than walking alongside as parents as well, and walking with them on the journey and being aware of what else might be at play. We've talked about the fact that all the stats show that co-occurring mental health conditions, ASD characteristics, trauma, internal homophobia, all these kind of things are very often present. So you as a parent might already be aware that actually your young person was diagnosed with depression, say, or exhibiting a potential experience of depression, or actually there are some ASD characteristics there, or actually they'd already been identifying as bisexual, so they're already questioning their gender. And just keeping those things, being aware of them, having them in conversation, continuing to explore those, get support for those as necessary to kind of keep it broad. And just a final one, I think it's a key thing for parents in this situation is not to let gender become the be-all and end-all of the relationship and the family and the conversation. Because so often what happens to these young people is they conclude that they are transgender, and that becomes their world. And getting testosterone when it comes to their world, and they fall into an online world where all that matters is that. And very often the story is they give up on other hobbies, they give up on in-person friendships, they descend into this online world where it's gender, 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 gender. And a bit like we said earlier about how terms can unhelpfully reinforce things for us, so can the narrowing of our world down to that. And so actually encouraging and helping your young person keep involved in active hobbies they enjoy, seeing other friends, just talking to them about plenty of other things that aren't gender, just helps keep their world broader than the gender, and also shows that you are not obsessed about their gender, but you really love them. You love them beyond the gender questions as well. So there's just some really practical, helpful things about keeping life a lot broader than gender to stop a young person getting fixated or kind of falling down the rabbit hole of that's all that matters.
Andrew, that's a great word. And I'm sure there's a lot of parents listening that will be really blessed by that. Really excited about your book, Finding Your Best Identity. What's the subtitle again of the book?
A short Christian introduction to identity, sexuality, and gender.
Right. Yeah, it's a great book. I'm excited to have people get a hold of it. So people always ask me, well, where can I find it? There's this thing called Amazon, or just Google it. I'm sure you'll figure it out. But Andrew, thank you so much for your work at Living Out and for your writing. I hope you write 20 more books in the near future. love all the stuff you put out.
It's a challenge. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. God bless.
This show is part of the Converge Podcast Network.